Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. So this is week 11, so we're at chapter 10, and it's kind of exciting because we're getting through to current day stuff, although we're going to back up a little bit, especially when we cover the last few weeks of the class. But for now, we're in chapter 10, and it's covering modern Europe, and the periodization, the time length of this chapter is far-reaching because it covers everything from after World War II all the way up to current times, including like the European Union and some of the more recent issues with the EU. That having been said, it's not a long chapter, so it kind of glosses through everything, and that's okay. I mean, this week, let's take a breather. We don't have an assignment this week. There's no quiz. There's no essay, so it's one of our weeks off. And this stuff's important, but I think that the easiest way to remember what's going on in Western Europe, really for the most part, after the 60s and 70s starts to parallel what's going on in the U.S. as far as, they have their 60s moment, if you will, and you'll read about that. It talks about art and culture and, again, this movement towards modernism with some differences as far as art is concerned, especially with German artists incorporating, the post-World War II sentiment, of course. Same with music. But for the most part, it's rock and roll, more modern art, culturally in the 60s and 70s, experimentation with drugs and more open sexuality as far as, men and women both are concerned. So that's going on. So as you read through this, try not to get too hung up on, boy, I got to know all this, because just think of Western Europe as basically the same as the U.S. and, a booming economy after the war, and then some economic difficulties, into the 80s and in the 70s and 80s with oil price issues and that sort of thing. But again, parallel with the U.S., and you're good to go there. So, but let me kind of get started on the chapter and go through a quick overview for you to point out some of the interesting parts. So in our last chapter, chapter 9, that was really all about the Cold War, and just to bring you up to date, World War II ends, and the Soviet Union strengthens their position and takes over most of Eastern Europe. You remember that Germany was divided between East and West Germany, so we read about that last week, and these spheres of influence between communism and democracy, if you will, with the U.S., sort of this Western and Eastern Iron Curtain thing going. So we talked about all of that, and so now we get into this next chapter. Now, we ended the last chapter with the ending of the Cold War in '89, and the unification of Germany's comes in 90, like right after that. So we'll cover a little bit of that in this chapter, but these chapters don't always run chronologically. In other words, chapter 9 ends in 1989, and the chapter we just started goes back and starts us basically till after the war, but only paints things in really broad strokes. So as I said before, we have the picture of Berlin on the cover of this module, and it shows that Berlin's in tatters. Actually, my dad was there. He was a World War II veteran and saw Berlin afterwards, and it was totally devastated, as were many of the major cities in Europe. And the Marshall Plan is a U.S. plan to give money to Europe to rebuild after World War II. So that's an important thing to know, because without the Marshall Plan, I think that there would have been a big danger for more of Europe to fall under the USSR, the ideology of communism, and certainly the U.S. knew that as well. So the Marshall Plan was this idea that, because the U.S.'s economy was booming after World War II, we didn't have anything to rebuild, of course, in this country. The U.S. decided to commit, I think, $13-14 billion, which was real money back then, to European nations for rebuilding. And it really worked. Not only did the, France and England for sure, and Germany for sure, I mean, they turned around in a matter of 20 to 30 years and became these huge industrial powerhouses. Plus, the other benefit of the Marshall Plan was that, it kept the U.S. to be a major influence in Western Europe. And as far as the Cold War is concerned, the Marshall Plan created a lot of loyalty between countries that were near the USSR, especially Germany. So the Marshall Plan was a good thing, and it really helped rebuild Europe quickly. And I think that's one of focus questions in the text is, what contributed to the economic miracle in Europe after World War II. And certainly if you just say the Marshall Plan there, you're good to go. And so that's what the Marshall Plan was all about. It was a real big deal at the time, and still is. I mean, historically, I think it made a real difference in the outcome of Western European countries and Eastern European countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. So it was a big thing. And so the book talks about how not only the countries rebuilt under the auspices of the Marshall Plan, but also this formation of the modern welfare state. So that does not have a bad connotation to it. In this case, it's talking about how the Western European countries grew after World War II as far as their social model and their economic model. So most countries in Europe, and Canada is the same way, are really called social democracies, or they fall under this idea of the social democratic model, which is a combination of capitalism only with social benefits. So there's a laissez-faire, free market capitalism, every man for themselves, but taxation is a little higher to cover social programs such as higher education, healthcare, generous retirement benefits, mandatory 4 weeks off a year regardless of your job in Europe. So there's a lot of social benefits built into the social democratic model. But that's the way, like Germany and France and England and all the Sweden, all the Nordic countries, Italy, that's kind of the way they're all set up, and they are to this day. And our, even though not Europe, our neighbor to the north, Canada, as I mentioned, is also set up in that social democratic model. So that's what happens in France and in Germany and in Britain after the war. And in all cases, there are economic strains because these countries go through, like the Great Recession in 2008. I mentioned the OPEC oil crisis in the 70s. The economic strains that we feel here in the U.S. are certainly felt in Europe, and definitely caused a strain on this social democratic model because costs are high when you have to cover everyone's health care and education and that sort of thing. So that's sort of the classic argument. But for the most part, the modern welfare state that started in Western European countries after World War II is still in place and is still working well, and arguably maybe even better than our system sometimes. So that's another thing. But as you read through this, you'll read about France and what they went through after de Gaulle, and there was Mitterrand in the 80s and Jacques Chirac in 95, and so everyone had their own challenges with the economy in France. Emmanuel Macron, who's in currently, he won, I think the last election was 2017, and he's a centrist because all of these European countries are trying to balance the social benefits that they give to their citizens with the economy and the cost and how to pay for all this stuff. So France is no different. Germany, same way. The thing about Germany is that it's actually done really well since 1990 when it reunified, although bringing East Germany into West Germany was a huge economic strain and still is to this day. Angela Merkel was elected in 2005. She was the first prime minister, if you will, of Germany, chancellor of Germany, and first woman chancellor, and is still in power. So she's been in for a long time and is a very skilled politician to navigate through everything Germany's been through, including the formation of the European Union, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So Angela Merkel is still in office since 2005, and then when we go to England, really, if you look at France and Germany, England's really kind of had the toughest time economically. Their economy has suffered on and off a lot since World War II, and a lot of it has been, all Western countries have sort of changed from an industrial model to more of a service economy. That's certainly happened in the U.S. as we lose our manufacturing jobs, and that's happened in France and it happened in Germany. But that hurt England perhaps far more than others because some of England's heavy industries really took a big hit even up till 2000. So their economy's really been suffering, but at the same time, they've been through a number of changes in leadership between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and Margaret Thatcher, who you may probably haven't heard of because you guys are too young, but Margaret Thatcher was in when Reagan was in the 80s, and they called her the Iron Lady. She was very conservative. She was prime minister, first woman prime minister actually, and various others, John Major all the way through, and so various other English leaders who were either with the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, roughly equivalent to Democrats and Republicans here. And so, it's not been easy for England either. Currently, Boris Johnson is in office. He was elected in 2019. He's a conservative hardliner. I'm sure you've seen him on the news. But again, with all these countries, to a large extent, they've paralleled the U.S. with sort of the boom and bust economic realities of market capitalism. So that's kind of how the Western European countries grew up until current times politically. And the book kind of skips around, so it goes back into Eastern Europe and talks about how Eastern Europe fared right after World War II, and we all know that story because they were they were behind the Iron Curtain. But then after the fall of the dropping or the raising of the Iron Curtain, whatever you want to call it, after 1989, 1990. It was a lot tougher for Eastern European countries to get back into the world market. I mean, they had no experience with democratic governments. They had no experience with free market capitalism. So, plus the fact that in Eastern Europe there are so many more small ethnic divides than there are in Western Europe, which has caused a number of issues that are still going on today. So, I mean, probably the best example of that is looking at Yugoslavia after World War II. And, if you know anything about what was Yugoslavia, it was sort of a made-up country. There were really like 6 states in Yugoslavia. You've heard of some of these: Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia. Kosovo was a little, newly created country, Serbia, and none of these people got along. So, even up through the 70s and the 80s and then in the 1990s, there's still ethnic cleansing going on. The Serbians are, forcing Bosnian Muslims out of the country and killing them. So this is still a real hotbed, and most of it is because of these strong ethnicities and strong cultural relationships and common languages and common religions. So that's still a mess and has been for a long time. And it's so Ukraine. You hear about Ukraine, and these countries are all in that area where things are still to a large extent being sorted out, and certainly Russia plays a big influence in that area. So you read about that in the book. But I remember there was just so much trouble in Bosnia and Kosovo, not that long ago. That was on the news. So that's something to know about. And then the chapter really finishes with Western European unity, which I call modern in my notes. And again, everything here parallels the U.S. I think that the biggest thing that's really different between what's going on in Europe right now and going on in the U.S. is the immigration issue. Now, yes, there's definitely a political immigration issue in the U.S. right now, and I won't get into the current day politics on that, but the issue that's created in the U.S. right now is really the issue of our southern border and Mexican immigrants. But the issue in Europe is a lot different, and the issue in Europe really involves the Middle East, and all of the disruptions in life in the Middle East have led to the creation of a lot of refugees, Middle Eastern refugees. So there's been a ton of Middle Eastern refugees coming into Europe, and when you look at a country like Germany, for example, I mean, their immigration laws are very loose, very lax. So you could basically come right in. And I was reading, I think in France, it's like 20% are immigrants of the people right now. So there's this there's this rising sort of right-wing, ugly anti-immigrant sentiment going on, and one of the reasons is because unemployment's raising, and the people, the nationalists, the French citizens or the German citizens are basically saying, hey, these immigrants are taking all of our jobs. And what hasn't helped has been a variety of terrorist attacks in Western Europe by Middle Easterners. So this whole idea of discrimination and suspicion, and really sort of this rising ethnic anger is going on in Europe, and that's something to watch, because there is a rise of right-wing politics in Europe, and political parties in Europe can be formed and can die out overnight. It's not like the U.S. where political parties are more entrenched. So definitely watch what's going on in Europe, because immigration's still a problem, and this sort of radical right wing is still rising in Europe, and it's an issue. So anyway, that's it. There's a bit in there about the environment and the environmental movement in Western Europe. So it's basically ahead of us, in case, no surprise there. But you can read about the art and entertainment scene. It's a short chapter, not much to it. And again, we're on a break as far as assignments go. So I'll see you again next week. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.